With this ring, I thee wed. Those were the words the head of the Draven family was supposed to say. He didn't. 400 guests watched from the pews of Street. Patrick's old cathedral senators, judges, 3 rival bosses, and every made man in New York who still mattered, and not one of them would later admit what they saw. Because when the priest held out the small velvet cushion, when the cathedral fell so quiet you could hear the candles breathing, August Draven looked down at the ring, looked up at his bride, and closed his hand around the band without placing it on her finger. He didn't explain. He didn't apologize. He simply said, "I do," and slipped the ring into the inside pocket of his jacket, where it stayed for the rest of the night. The bride didn't flinch. That was the part no one could stop talking about later. She stood there in her ivory gown, her bouquet of white peonies trembling only slightly, and she said her vows with the steady voice of a woman who'd already decided she wouldn't be broken in public. Her name was Everly Hawthorne. She was 26 years old, and she'd learned a long time ago that the quietest women in a room are usually the ones who've survived the most. They didn't speak in the car home. They didn't speak in the elevator to the 68th floor. And when the penthouse doors finally closed behind them, when there was no one left in the world who could hear, he turned to her across that cold, glass-walled room and said, in a voice as quiet as a safety being clicked off, "I know who you really are." He didn't raise his hand. He didn't raise his voice. He set the ring down on the marble table between them, walked out onto the terrace, and left her standing there still in her wedding dress, still holding the flowers she'd forgotten to set down. What August Draven believed he knew about his bride had arrived 3 days earlier. A USB drive. No name, no note. He'd watched it once. He hadn't destroyed it, and that more than anything said or unsaid at the altar that night was the detail that would undo him. If this opening has you hooked, tap that like button, share this story with someone who loves a dangerous slow burn, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Your support is what keeps stories like this one alive. Now, let's step back into that silent penthouse, where a woman in a wedding dress is about to make herself a promise that will change both of their lives forever. The sound of August's footsteps faded across the marble floor outside the balcony, and when the glass door closed behind him, the great room on the 68th floor became so quiet that Everly could hear the heater breathing very softly beneath the floorboards. She was still standing in the middle of that glass-walled room, still wearing the ivory Vera Wang gown, still holding the bouquet of white peonies whose petals had already begun to wilt at the edges. It took a very long time, so long that she stopped counting, before she moved her first finger. She set the bouquet down on the marble table, carefully, as if it were something that could break. The ring was lying there, exactly where he had placed it before stepping outside. A simple band of platinum, unengraved, without a stone, only a closed circle catching the yellow light of the room. She looked at it for a moment, and didn't touch it. Then she laid the bouquet beside it, and the ring and the flowers rested close together on the stone surface like two things someone had forgotten in a room that didn't belong to them. She walked toward the master bedroom. The wedding gown was heavier than she had imagined. It had been heavy all day, but she hadn't allowed herself to feel it in front of 400 people. Now, with no one left but herself, the weight of the silk, of the pearls sewn along the collar, of the 7 layers of full skirt, seemed to press down on her shoulders like a sentence. She reached behind her back and searched for the tiny row of buttons running down her spine. There was no one to undo them for her. No lady's maid, no sister, no mother, not even the husband who should have been the first to touch that line of buttons. She undid them one by one, very slowly, very evenly, from her neck to her waist, then lower still, until the dress slipped from her shoulders and spilled onto the floor like a pool of frozen cream. She stepped out of it. She bent down, lifted it with both hands, and folded it, not hurriedly, not roughly, as if it were a flag that had to be folded properly after a funeral. She placed the folded gown at the foot of the wedding bed. The bed was still perfectly smooth, the cream silk coverlet still folded by the staff into a flawless triangle, 2 down pillows resting side by side, a small vase on the nightstand holding 3 white roses, not a single crease, not a single sign that anyone had sat there, had lain there, had lived there. She sat on the edge of the bed, in the thin white silk undergarment from her wedding day, and she looked at the folded dress beside her. She looked at the room. She looked at the city burning cold and electric beyond the glass. Manhattan spread below like a kingdom of glass and smoke. She looked at the platinum ring lying on the marble table in the next room. the ring he had deliberately not placed on her finger in the church, and had deliberately not taken with him when he stepped onto the balcony, a ring abandoned twice in the same night. And in that moment, a very quiet voice rose somewhere in her chest, a voice she had known well since she was 18, standing beside Isabel's coffin, and understanding that from then on, she would have to protect herself. That voice told her she was allowed to cry now, that there was no one here to see, that 8 years of silence had been enough, that one night of collapse wouldn't make her weak. Everly Hawthorne heard that voice, and she chose not to listen. She placed both hands on her thighs, drew in one very slow breath, and made herself a promise there in the room where no one existed except her and a wedding bed no one had touched, that tonight she wouldn't cry. Tonight she would think, because something was wrong. Something was very wrong with the words he had just spoken. I know who you really are. A man who had spent 3 months negotiating this marriage, who had met her 4 times in rooms full of witnesses, who had signed documents both sides' attorneys had read over again and again. A man like that didn't suddenly decide on his wedding night that his wife was someone else, unless someone had told him so. And she knew, with the cold certainty of someone who had lived in Ashcroft House for 19 years, that when a powerful man suddenly believes he has been deceived, the question isn't what he believes, but who placed that belief into his ear. And that question, she realized just as the light outside the balcony finally went dark, was the question that might save her life. To answer the question of who had placed that belief into August Draven's ear, Everly had to begin much farther back than tonight, with an April afternoon 20 years earlier, on a stretch of coastal road on Long Island that she no longer remembered clearly, but still dreamed about from time to time, the stretch of road where her mother's car, Margaret Hawthorne's car, veered out of its lane and crashed into a concrete guardrail at a speed violent enough to kill a healthy, sober, clear-minded woman of 31 instantly. A woman who wasn't drunk, wasn't on medication, and didn't have time to leave even a single word behind for the 6-year-old daughter sitting in the back seat. The police said it was an accident. There was no second party, no slashed tire, no tampered brakes, only a curve in the road, a patch of rainwater, and a young mother whose family on her mother's side was already gone, leaving no one alive to ask why she had been driving alone on an afternoon when she should have been at home with her child. Everly was pulled from the back seat with a bruise on her temple and a silence that wouldn't leave her for the next 20 years. She had no father, at least not one whose name appeared on her birth certificate, and when a strange woman in a gray coat came to the hospital that night and bent down beside her, Everly remembered only that the woman smelled of bitter perfume and had very cold hands. A year later, just after she turned 7, she was taken in by a married couple. They were Desmond and Beatrice Ashcroft, and they lived in a 4-story red brick house on the Upper East Side, a house with its own private elevator, a 2-story library, and an Irish housekeeper named Mrs. Fenwick, who always looked at Everly with a kind of pity no one ever explained. No one in that house explained anything to her. No one told her why they had chosen her. No one told her why her name remained Hawthorne instead of becoming Ashcroft. No one told her why Desmond, the man the world called Mr. Ashcroft, and whom the people who came to the house at night addressed by another title that Everly wouldn't understand until many years later, almost never looked her in the eye when he passed her on the staircase. Beatrice was the opposite. Beatrice looked at her too much, always with something in her eyes that 7-year-old Everly had no word for, though later, when she was older, she would understand it was a mixture of guilt, liquor, and a fear Beatrice never once spoke aloud. Beatrice drank in the morning. Beatrice drank at noon. Beatrice drank through the long evenings when Desmond didn't come home, and the red brick house grew so vast it could swallow a child whole. And during those evenings, Everly learned to walk barefoot across wooden floors, learned to close doors without letting them make a sound, learned how to make herself so small that no one could remember she was there at all. There was one person who always remembered: Isabel Ashcroft, the eldest biological child of Desmond and Beatrice, 4 years older than Everly, with Irish copper-red hair and green eyes like her mother's, was the first person to enter Everly's room on the night she was brought into the house, and sit down on the edge of her bed without saying a single word for an entire hour. Then at last Isabel spoke, very softly, and said that from now on, Everly would be Isabel's little sister, and no one in that house would ever be allowed to make Isabel's little sister cry without paying for it. Not Desmond, not Beatrice. Isabel kept that promise for 11 years. It was Isabel who taught her to read the books Desmond forbade. It was Isabel who stole ice cream from the freezer on nights when Beatrice passed out on the chaise, with spilled wine soaking into the carpet. It was Isabel who sat with her in the hospital when she had pneumonia at 12, and Beatrice didn't appear for 3 days. And it was Isabel who, on a November morning when Everly was 18 and preparing to begin school at Columbia, was found dead in her bedroom in the Ashcroft house, with an empty bottle of sleeping pills on the table and a very short letter left for her mother. Isabel was 22. The New York police ruled it a suicide in less than 48 hours. There was no further investigation, no full autopsy. Desmond handled everything, and Desmond was the kind of man people in New York didn't question. Everly didn't believe that conclusion for even a second. Not because she had evidence, but because she knew Isabel. She knew the sister who had promised she would never leave her alone in that house. And she knew Isabel wasn't the kind of person who broke a promise by dying on purpose. But Everly was only 18, and no one listened to an 18-year-old girl in a family like the Ashcrofts, and so she did the only thing she had known how to do since she was 7. She became silent. She became small. She waited, and for the 8 years between that day and tonight, she had waited for a sign that would tell her why her sister had died, and who had killed her, and why she, the daughter no one had wanted, was the only one left in that house to ask the questions no one wanted to answer. The sign Everly had waited 8 years for came on a Thursday afternoon in July, 3 months before the wedding, in the small sitting room on the second floor of the red brick house on the Upper East Side, where Beatrice Ashcroft had spent most of her waking hours since Isabel died. Beatrice was sitting in the familiar blue velvet armchair, with her second glass of white wine of the afternoon on the table beside her, and she didn't look Everly in the eye when she said the name. The Draven family had asked for a marriage, Beatrice said, her voice flat, as though she were reading a grocery list. Desmond had agreed. The wedding would take place in the fall. The man would be August Draven, head of the family. Everly had heard that name before. Anyone in New York had, at least in passing, but she said nothing for a very long time. And at last Beatrice looked up, and in her damp eyes there was something almost like pleading, something Everly had never seen in her adoptive mother before. "This is a peace treaty between 2 families," Beatrice said. "Desmond is in a difficult position. You are the only thing left in this house that still has value to them. Do you understand?" Everly understood. She had understood since she was 7 that she was an asset, and assets are bought, kept, and traded away when necessary. What she didn't tell Beatrice that afternoon, what she wouldn't tell anyone in that house, was the real reason she nodded and agreed less than 10 seconds after the name Draven was spoken, because 8 years earlier, on the morning she found Isabel, in the space between calling the ambulance and the moment the police arrived, Everly had exactly 7 minutes alone in that room, and in those 7 minutes, with an instinct she would later thank her sister for teaching her through years of carefulness, she searched. She knew Isabel always hid important things in the same place, inside the leather-bound copy of Jane Eyre that Isabel had given her on her 10th birthday and kept on her own bedside table like a twin to it. And inside Isabel's copy of Jane Eyre that morning, tucked between pages 183 and 184, was a handwritten letter on a sheet of pale yellow paper folded into 4. She picked it up, slipped it inside her blouse, and when the police arrived, she didn't tell anyone about it. Not ever. Not in 8 years. That letter had traveled with her to Columbia dormitories, to the tiny apartment in Brooklyn she rented with her librarian's salary, to every place she went, folded inside a sealed envelope in the innermost compartment of the handbag she always carried. Its contents weren't long, only a single paragraph, written in haste, Isabel's handwriting leaning more sharply than usual, as though she had written it while listening to footsteps outside the door. "Everly, if the day comes when they bring you to the Draven house, don't refuse. You need to go there. You need to know the truth about me, about your mother, about everything. There is a box in their house. I sent it through V, before." That was where the letter ended, at the word before, with no period, no dash, only a blank space Everly had stared into for 8 years, as if staring into an abyss. V could have been anyone. A lawyer named Vincent, a friend named Vanessa, a journalist named Victor. She had tried to search quietly through everything she could find about the Draven family, about Isabel's friends, about any name beginning with the letter V that might connect to both families. And in 8 years she hadn't found a single answer that truly convinced her. But when Beatrice spoke the name August Draven in that sitting room on that July afternoon, Everly knew. She knew with a certainty so sharp it nearly stunned her that this was the door Isabel had tried to open for her 8 years earlier. This was the road her sister had laid out for her with ink and blood, and the foresight of someone who knew she might not live long enough to walk it beside her. The Draven house. The box. She would marry August Draven not because of the peace treaty between Desmond and him, not because Beatrice had pleaded, not because she had no other choice. She would marry him because a 22-year-old girl had died in an upstairs room of this house 8 years ago and left her a slip of paper with 4 lines on it, and had believed she was strong enough to one day reach that place and find what her sister hadn't lived long enough to say. And that was the secret Everly carried with her when she walked into St. Patrick's old cathedral on that autumn afternoon. That was the secret she carried when she stood before the altar and spoke her vows in a voice that didn't tremble. That was the secret she was carrying now, sitting on the edge of the wedding bed in a silk dress, in a room where the man who was supposed to protect her had just said that he knew who she really was. Only, he didn't know. No one in this world knew, not even her. Just a few meters away, separated only by a wall of reinforced glass and an iron door so thick that no one had ever heard a sound from the other side, August Draven was standing on the open-air terrace of the 68th floor, smoking the first cigarette he had touched in 6 years. He had quit on the exact day his father died, for reasons that had nothing to do with health, and everything to do with the habits of a man who wanted control over every small detail of his life, and for 6 years he hadn't laid a hand on a single pack. Tonight he had. He had walked straight from the drawing room onto the balcony, opened the 3rd drawer of the mahogany cabinet set against the railing, where he kept a bottle of Japanese whiskey and an already opened pack of Marlboro Red from 6 years earlier, and he had lit one without hesitation. The smoke tasted strange on his tongue, like something awakened from a long sleep. August Draven was 37 years old, a second-generation Sicilian-American, 6 feet 2 inches tall, with black hair lightly touched with silver at the temples, the blue-gray eyes of a mother from an old northern Italian line, and the hard structure of a Sicilian father who had carried that blood from a small village near Agrigento to Brooklyn in the winter of 1951. He wasn't cruel. That was what anyone who had worked with him over the last 10 years would say if anyone ever asked. Though no one asked. Because in the world, August Draven ruled. Questions like that had a way of answering themselves through silence. He was precise. He read 7 newspapers every morning in exactly 40 minutes. He never gave an order twice. He never signed a document he hadn't read to the final line. He controlled 6 neighborhoods in Brooklyn, 3 ports along the East Coast, a network of restaurants and private clubs in Manhattan so tangled that even the Internal Revenue Service had given up trying to understand it, and 3 of the judges who sat in judgment over his men whenever they were unlucky enough to be arrested. That wasn't cruelty. That was precision. But precision, in a man with power like his, could look exactly like cruelty from the outside, and August Draven was old enough to understand that the distinction didn't matter to the people standing beneath his gaze. On the balcony tonight, he wasn't thinking about his empire. He was thinking about 2 people who had died. The first was his sister, Vesper Draven, 23 years old, found in a car that had gone over the side of a bridge near Greenwich, Connecticut, on a night in October, 8 years earlier. The weather had been dry, the road had been clear, the car had been new. Vesper had been the most careful driver he had ever known, a girl so cautious she had refused to get a license until she was 21 because she didn't trust her own reflexes. Connecticut State Police ruled it a single-vehicle accident caused by loss of control at high speed. No one in the Draven family believed that. But when August investigated on his own for a full year afterward, he couldn't find a single thread to pull. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. No one knew anything. That absence of evidence didn't bring him peace. It carved a different kind of silence into him, the silence of a precise man forced to live with not knowing. The second was his father, Ezekiel Draven, 63 years old, found in his study at the family house in Oyster Bay one November morning 6 years earlier, with a bullet from his own gun buried beneath his chin. The police called it suicide. No one in New York with enough sense to read the signs believed that either. But the evidence that might have challenged it vanished before sunrise that same morning, and in the world Ezekiel Draven had built, when evidence disappeared, questions disappeared with it. August inherited that kingdom at 31, and in the 6 years since that day, he hadn't allowed himself to return to the question of who had killed his father, because he had learned that unanswered questions would eat a man alive from the inside until he could no longer give precise orders. His mother, Adelaide Draven, was still alive, 62 years old, small-framed, silver-haired, her hands always wearing the 2 rings of her dead husband. She ran the public face of the family with the perfection of a woman who had done that work since she was a young bride from Milan. The charities, the restaurants, the fundraising galas for children's hospitals. What Adelaide didn't run was what happened after midnight at the ports of Brooklyn, and that had been the unspoken arrangement between mother and son since Ezekiel's death, an arrangement that had never needed to be spoken aloud. Tonight, on the balcony of the 68th floor, August smoked his first cigarette in 6 years and thought about the USB drive locked inside his safe downstairs. He had watched it once. Only once. He had the memory of a man trained never to need a second viewing. And now, in his mind, the image of the woman in the wedding dress, standing behind the glass door 3 meters behind him, was sliding over another image, the image the USB had shown him 3 days earlier, and the 2 images didn't match in a way a precise man like August Draven should have recognized from the very beginning. He crushed the cigarette against the stone railing, and he didn't go back inside. At 7:30 the next morning, Everly came down to the dining room at exactly the hour the Draven family served breakfast. Not 1 minute early, not 1 minute late, wearing a simple gray wool dress and a pair of low-heeled shoes, with her hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck as though she were going to work, rather than coming down to breakfast on the first morning of her new life. This was a decision, not a habit. She could have remained in the room. She could have spoken through the intercom and said she wasn't feeling well, and no one on this 68th floor would have dared question it. New brides were allowed to be fragile, but Everly Hawthorne hadn't survived 19 years in the Ashcroft house by retreating, and she had no intention of beginning to retreat on the first morning of the rest of her life. August was already seated at the head of the table. He was reading the printed Wall Street Journal, as he did every morning, and he didn't look up when she entered. He was wearing a white shirt open at the collar, no tie, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and on his left wrist was an old Patek Philippe watch she had noticed he always wore, not because it was expensive, but because it was old in the particular way only inherited things could be old. She sat at the opposite end of the table, 4 meters of polished black oak between them, and she waited. The servant, a tall, lean young man in a black suit named Tomas, whom she had been introduced to the afternoon before, emerged from the kitchen carrying a silver coffee pot, took 3 steps toward her, then stopped. Not because she had made a gesture. She made no gesture at all. He stopped because, by instinct, his eyes had turned toward the bodyguard standing in the corner of the room, the broad-shouldered man in the gray suit named Rocco Barone, whom she had seen 3 times since the night before. And Rocco Barone hadn't nodded. Tomas stood there with the coffee pot in his hand, in a moment stretched long enough for her to understand. Coffee wouldn't be poured until her husband gave permission, and her husband was reading the newspaper and couldn't be bothered to look up. She said nothing. She rose from her chair, walked 4 steps around the table, took the coffee pot from Tomas's hand so gently he didn't have time to resist, returned to her seat, and poured herself a full cup. She set the pot down on the table. She added sugar. She stirred. She took the first sip. The coffee was hot and bitter and perfect, and she didn't look toward August even once through the whole of it. Then she sat still. August kept reading. The clock on the mantel ticked. Beyond the windows, the sun had risen over Central Park and turned the October trees into a pool of molten brass. She counted, not because she was restless, but because counting was what she did with her mind when the rest of her had to remain very still. 7 minutes, 8 minutes, 9. At the 11th minute, he turned the final page of the newspaper, folded it in half, set it down beside his plate, and said, still without looking at her, that he would be going to Boston this week and would return on Friday. I understand, she said. And am I going with you, or is that no longer part of the arrangement? He looked up. It was the first time he had looked at her since she entered the room, and she held his gaze without blinking, because she had decided somewhere between midnight and dawn that she was finished with blinking first. In his blue-gray eyes, for no more than half a second, something passed through that she would think about many times in the weeks ahead. Not surprise. Not anger. Something closer to seeing a detail that didn't match the file. A single line of figures out of place in a ledger. The first crack in a wall he had thought seamless. He looked at her a second longer than necessary. Then he said, "You will come with me." After that, he returned to his newspaper. But he wasn't truly reading anymore. She finished her coffee in silence, stood, and left the room before he had time to fold the paper a second time. The trip to Boston never happened for her. 2 days after that silent breakfast, August flew out alone with 2 bodyguards and a lawyer, leaving her a message through the housekeeper that the plan had changed and that she was encouraged to consider the penthouse her home. Encouraged was his word. In the Ashcroft house, Everly had learned how to recognize when an encouragement was really an order, and she didn't need anyone to explain to her that the 68th floor of this building overlooking Central Park, with its private elevator requiring a fingerprint code and a terrace enclosed in 3-centimeter thick bullet-resistant glass, was a cage decorated so exquisitely that it took several days to notice the bars. Her phone had been replaced on the wedding night. Her old contacts had been erased. The new phone could call only 3 numbers: August's number, the housekeeper Margot's number, and the number for a private medical service she had never once needed. No social media apps, no email, not even a weather app. She didn't complain. On the 3rd day after the wedding, she woke at 6 and began building a schedule, not on paper but in her mind, where no one could read it. 6 o'clock, wake. 6:30, treadmill in the gym on the 67th floor, 45 minutes, running until her lungs burned and her thoughts no longer crashed into one another. 7:30, shower. 8 o'clock, breakfast alone in the small Eastern dining room, soft boiled eggs and dark toast and an orange. 9 until noon, August's library, where there were nearly 2,000 books, arranged not alphabetically but by subject, from Phoenician naval history to modern behavioral economics, and she had begun at the far left end of the highest shelf and would work her way down shelf by shelf, book by book, through whatever amount of time she had left here. Noon, alone. Afternoon, embroidery on the terrace if the weather was good, more books if it wasn't. Evening, alone, except on the nights he returned. And he returned every night. That was what it took her 4 days to realize. He might not speak a word to her. He might not dine with her. He might go straight into the study at the end of the eastern hallway and close the door. And she might not see him again until the breakfast table the next morning, if she saw him there at all. But he came home, every night. No exceptions. Even on the night he stayed in Boston longer than she had expected. He flew back at 11 o'clock, and she heard the elevator chime in the hallway outside her bedroom just before midnight. A man certain he had taken the wrong wife doesn't trouble himself to come home. She noted that carefully in her mind, the way a mapmaker marks an island at sea she hasn't yet reached. She also began marking the people who moved through the penthouse. There were 6 primary bodyguards, working 8-hour shifts on a schedule she had memorized after 1 week. The day shift was covered by Rocco Barone and Declan Moore, 2 men who could stand still for 5 hours without moving a single millimeter. The afternoon shift belonged to Vincenzo, Callahan, and Thomas Bellini, and Vincenzo was the only one who sometimes offered the faintest smile when she passed. The night shift belonged to the 2 Corsi cousins, both 6 feet 3 inches tall and both men who never said more than 2 words to her. All 6 were loyal to August, to a degree that left her unable to see a single gap in the way they operated, except for Rocco Barone. Rocco had been in the breakfast room that morning, when Tomas waited for the nod before pouring coffee. Rocco was the one whose gaze she had felt between her shoulder blades the first time she walked down the hallway toward the library. And Rocco, on the 7th day after the wedding, had looked at her 3 seconds longer than necessary as she passed the gym door, a look that wasn't polite and wasn't the assessment of a professional, but something else, something measuring, something calculating, as though he were comparing her face to another face he had seen somewhere before. She hadn't looked back. She had walked straight into the gym and run 15 minutes beyond her schedule, and when she left, she hadn't looked toward the corner where he stood. But that night she lay awake in her large bedroom, listening to the water from her husband's shower running in the room next to hers at 1 o'clock in the morning, and she added another line to the map in her head. Rocco Barone. Watch further. Do not trust. And she added another line as well, one she would return to many times in the weeks ahead. A man who is certain never troubles himself to come home. The invitation arrived in the 3rd week on a card of thick cream paper, handwritten in blue-black ink, in the steady, slanted script of a woman who had learned calligraphy from a nun in Milan 60 years earlier. The card was brought into the breakfast room with the coffee pot on Thursday, not by the housekeeper Margot, but by Rocco Barone himself, who placed it beside Everly's plate without a word and stepped back 2 paces to wait for her to read it, as though he had been instructed to make certain she received it. She read it once. Adelaide Draven invited her to luncheon on Sunday at the seaside estate in Oyster Bay, alone, at 12:30. There was no explanation, no subject, no question. Sunday will come. That was all it said. She folded the card, slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan, nodded to Rocco, and Rocco left. On Sunday, she was taken there in a black armored Mercedes driven by Vincenzo Callahan, and the 90-minute journey along the Long Island Expressway passed in a kind of easy silence she hadn't been allowed to enjoy in 3 weeks. The Draven estate in Oyster Bay stood at the end of a private road, nearly a mile from the main gate, a 3-story gray-stone Tudor house, built in 1922 by a railroad magnate who went bankrupt during the Great Depression and bought by the Draven family in 1963, without a single brick being changed. Adelaide was waiting for her in the glass room overlooking Long Island Sound. She was wearing a pearl gray wool dress, a blue silk scarf loosely tied at her throat, and on the ring finger of her right hand were the 2 rings of her dead husband that Everly had heard described, but had never seen from so near. She rose when Everly entered, didn't embrace her, didn't kiss her cheek, only held out both hands and kept Everly's hands in hers for a moment, and Adelaide's hands were warm and dry and steady, in a way that made Everly, for the first time in 3 weeks, almost let herself loosen. They ate baked cod with asparagus and a small salad from the garden. They shared a bottle of Sancerre left half full, and they spoke about books. That was all Adelaide wanted to speak about. Not one question about August. Not one question about the wedding night that all of New York had been whispering about for 3 weeks. Not one question about Everly's parents, about the Ashcroft house, about any of the things an ordinary mother-in-law would have asked a new bride. Instead, Adelaide asked what Everly was reading, and when Everly said she had just opened The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov, which she had found on the 4th shelf from the left in August's library, something gentle passed through Adelaide's eyes, and for the next hour and a half, they spoke of the devil Woland, and the black cat Behemoth, and the manuscript that never burns in the fire. Adelaide had read that book in the original Russian when she was 20, during a winter she spent in Leningrad with an aunt, long dead, and she quoted a line of Bulgakov in Russian that Everly didn't understand, but would remember, because the sound of it felt like prophecy. When the clock on the mantel struck 3, and Vincenzo appeared in the doorway to say that the car was ready, Adelaide rose and walked her all the way to the stone steps before the house, and there, in the slanting October sunlight leaning west, she stopped and placed one hand on Everly's wrist. The touch was so light that anyone looking from a distance would have seen only the polite gesture of a hostess, but Adelaide's hand stayed there for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds she looked straight into Everly's eyes and said, very softly, that her son was a precise man, and precision in a man with no love to soften it is only another name for cruelty, and she thought Everly was intelligent enough to know that. She also thought, Adelaide said, that if she wasn't mistaken about Everly, then she would survive whatever it was August was trying not to think about now. And when she did, Adelaide would be here. Adelaide's hand left her wrist. She smiled, a small smile, hardly a smile at all, and turned back into the house before Everly had time to answer. On the drive back to Manhattan, Everly sat in the rear seat of the black Mercedes and looked out at the dusk stretching across the highway, repeating every word Adelaide had said until she was certain she remembered it exactly. Precision without love is only another name for cruelty. If I am not mistaken about you, I will be here. She isn't mistaken, Everly thought. She has never been mistaken about anyone. 3 nights after the luncheon at Oyster Bay, August came home at 11:45 with a cut 5 centimeters long across the back of his left hand. Everly was sitting in the library when she heard the elevator chime in the hallway outside, and when she rose from her chair to make herself a cup of warm water in the small kitchen beside it, she passed the door of his study and saw him sitting on the edge of his desk beneath the only lamp that was lit, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled up, trying and failing to wrap a bandage around his hand with the other hand alone. He didn't see her. She didn't step inside. She only stood in the doorway for 2 seconds, long enough to recognize that the cut hadn't come from a kitchen knife, hadn't come from broken glass, hadn't come from anything that might happen in a kitchen or a boardroom. The wound was straight and clean and deepest in the middle, fading at both ends. The kind of cut a blade leaves when it touches skin in a horizontal motion, and she had lived 19 years in the Ashcroft house to recognize a wound like that without asking questions. She kept walking to the kitchen. She opened the second cabinet on the left, where Margot had shown her the family medical kit on the first day, and she took out the small black aluminum box marked with a white cross. She carried it back the way she had come. When she passed the door of August's study the second time, she didn't stop. She didn't say a word. She only stepped in far enough to place the box on the corner of the desk on his side, exactly 12 inches from his elbow, and she was already out of the room before he had time to look up. She returned to the library. She opened her book again to the page she had marked. She read 2 passages and remembered none of either one. Then she closed the book, turned off the lamp, and went back to her room. She didn't hear him come down the hallway until the clock on her bedside table read 1:18 in the morning. She didn't fall asleep until after 2. The next morning was Saturday. August didn't come down to the dining room at his usual hour. She ate breakfast alone, read 20 pages in the library from 9 until 10, and then she heard his footsteps on the eastern wood floor, coming toward her. He entered the library without announcement. In his left hand, where the cut was now neatly wrapped in a clean, narrow white bandage by someone who knew what he was doing, he carried a small silver tray. On the tray were 2 cups of tea, 2 saucers, a small milk pitcher, and a plate of butter biscuits. He set the tray on the low table between the 2 leather armchairs by the window. He placed 1 cup before her without asking, and she knew the instant the steam touched her nose that it was Earl Grey, brewed with a thin slice of lemon rather than milk, with half a spoonful of sugar, the only way she had drunk tea since she was 19, and had told the penthouse chef exactly once how she took it 3 weeks earlier. He didn't say why he knew. He didn't say why he had made it. He didn't say anything at all. He sat down in the armchair across from her, opened the Financial Times he had carried under his arm, and began to read. She took a sip of tea. It was hot and dark and exact, down to every note of flavor. She opened her book again. They sat like that for 40 minutes. Not one word, not one direct glance, only the sound of newspaper pages turning in his hands, book pages turning in hers, and the clock on the mantel behind her counting off each minute of what, later, when she remembered it, she would call their first date. When he rose, he folded the newspaper in half and tucked it beneath his left arm, and he had already reached the door before she said thank you for the tea. He stopped, but he didn't turn back. He nodded once, very slightly, to no one at all, and he left. 9 days after the silent morning tea, Finn Ashcroft called the penthouse and was informed by Margot that the bride's brother was in the building lobby, asking to come up. Everly had been expecting that call since the second day after the wedding, and she was surprised it hadn't come sooner. She told Margot to let him up. Finn entered the main drawing room at 3 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, wearing a gray cashmere coat from a Savile Row tailor that was 1 size too tight across the shoulders, carrying an oversized bouquet of white lilies and a green Ladurée box of chocolates tied with a silver ribbon. And his smile was so wide that Everly counted 8 teeth before she remembered she was counting. 32 years old, with Irish copper red hair cut too short at the sides and left too long on top. He had features that were regular when taken separately, but once assembled into a whole, there was something about them that didn't fit, as if the artist had drawn each detail with a ruler and forgotten that a face has to be felt, not merely measured. He set the flowers and chocolates on the coffee table, spread his arms wide, and stepped toward her, as if to embrace her. She held out her hand first, her left hand, palm up, a gesture polite enough that it couldn't be called distant, but clear enough to stop the embrace at 2 steps away. He stopped, laughed more loudly, and kissed the back of her hand. His lips were dry and cold. They sat down. Margot brought in tea and cakes, and Rocco Barone stood in the corner of the room in his gray suit, so silent that after 4 minutes, Finn seemed to have forgotten he was there. Finn talked a great deal. He talked about the weather, about how Desmond had been feeling tired lately, about how Beatrice hadn't left her room in 4 days, about a new yacht he was considering buying in Palm Beach, about how marvelous Everly had looked in her wedding dress at the church that day, and how the whole city had been talking about it. And he laughed after every sentence, as though waiting for applause. She drank her tea. She nodded where nodding was required. She didn't give him a single word more than necessary. At the 17th minute, Finn set his teacup down, leaned forward, and his voice dropped by 1 note, still cheerful, but now with an extra layer of sweetness she had heard many times in the Ashcroft house, whenever Desmond wanted something from a guest who didn't yet know he was being lured. "You know, Everly," he said, "you can always come home if things become difficult. Father is very worried about you." He told me last night that he wanted you to know the doors of the Ashcroft house will always remain open. Especially, he added. And here he paused for half a second to watch her eyes. If you happen to hear anything at all, about the Draven family that you think your father ought to know, you know father did business with Ezekiel Draven many years ago. He has never truly accepted the way Ezekiel died. He thinks someone inside that very family did it, and he would be very grateful. Do you understand? If one day you happen to overhear a name, a conversation, something that pointed to who killed Ezekiel Draven 6 years ago. He smiled when he said that final sentence. The room went silent. Rocco Barone in the corner didn't move a single millimeter, but Everly felt his attention sharpen like a blade just drawn from its sheath. She set her teacup onto its saucer without making a sound. She smiled at Finn, a very small, very courteous smile. The smile of a young woman who had grown up in a house where small smiles were the only shield she possessed. I'll remember father's words, she said. I'll walk you to the door. She rose before he had time to react. She walked with him to the elevator, shook his hand at the threshold, and closed the door. She turned back toward the drawing room. She stood at the window and looked down at Central Park for 2 minutes, and in those 2 minutes every piece in her mind fell into place with the cold iron click of a lock springing open. Finn was the one who had sent the USB drive. Finn didn't only know what was on it, Finn had created it. Because there was only one reason a brother would ask the new bride of the Draven family whether she had overheard anything about her father-in-law's death, and that reason wasn't a father's concern for his adopted daughter. That reason was that Finn needed her to stay alive a little longer, long enough to listen at doors, before the USB drive he had planted for August achieved its final effect. She didn't move away from the window until Margot came to ask what she wanted for dinner. She answered, gently, that tonight she wasn't hungry. 6 nights after Finn's visit, Everly's phone vibrated at 2:51 in the morning. It was Margot, not August, and Margot had never called her at night. Margot's voice was calm in the way of someone trained to remain calm when nothing else was. Mr. Draven will be home in 10 minutes, she said. He asked that no one be awakened. I'm calling because I thought you would want to know. She had wanted to know. She got out of bed, slipped a gray silk robe over her nightgown, and went into the main drawing room. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat down in the leather armchair near the window, where she could see the elevator hallway, and she waited. The elevator chimed at 3 o'clock exactly. August stepped out first, and behind him came Rocco Barone and Declan Moore, both of them close at either side like 2 moving barriers. August's jacket was torn at the left shoulder, the sleeve of the shirt beneath it soaked in a dark red-brown that was half dried and half still wet, and there was a long scrape running from his right cheekbone down to his jaw, not deep, but long enough to stain the collar. He walked straight. He didn't limp. He didn't lean on anyone. But when he saw her sitting in the darkness of the drawing room, he stopped for the briefest beat, and in that beat, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Something almost like exhaustion, not the exhaustion of the body, but the exhaustion of a man who had spent the entire evening calculating which of his own people had sold him out. He signaled for Rocco and Declan to withdraw. They did. He walked toward the study, and she rose and went into the kitchen. She opened the liquor cabinet. She took out the bottle of 16-year-old Lagavulin she knew he preferred, because over the past 3 weeks, she had noticed it was the only bottle on the top shelf that had gone down little by little each week. She poured a measure 2 fingers deep. She carried it into his study. He was sitting on the edge of the desk, removing his jacket, rolling the blood-stained shirt sleeve away from his left shoulder to inspect the wound beneath it. It was a graze from a bullet, not a puncture. The shot had passed outside the flesh of his shoulder by about 1.5 inches, leaving a red groove and a patch of scorched fabric. The bleeding had nearly stopped. He looked up when she entered. She set the glass of whiskey on the desk in front of him. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask anything. She sat down in the chair opposite him, folded her hands on her knees, and waited. He looked at the whiskey. He looked at her. He picked up the glass, took a long, slow drink, and set it down again. Then he laughed. A very small, very dry sound, closer to a cough than a laugh. And he said, "Why don't you ask me?" She looked straight at him. "Because you wouldn't tell me if I asked," she said. "And I learned a long time ago not to ask questions when I would have to beg for the answers." He fell silent. The single desk lamp in the study cast its light over the left side of his face and left the right in shadow. And in that uneven light she saw the thing she would remember most clearly about that night. He didn't argue. He didn't laugh again. He didn't give an order. He only held the whiskey glass in his uninjured hand and turned it once, then twice, and said, "Maybe I would tell you, if you asked." "Maybe," she said, "and maybe one day I will ask, when I'm ready to believe the answer." She stood. She meant to leave, and she had taken 3 steps toward the door when he said her name. Only once, Everly. She stopped with one hand on the doorframe. She didn't turn back. He hadn't spoken her name since the wedding night, and in his voice now there was none of the coldness of a door locked from that night. There was only something it took her a second to recognize, and when she did, she almost laughed at the absurdity of it. He was lonely. The most powerful man she had ever been trapped in a room with, sitting behind her with a bullet wound in his shoulder and a glass of whiskey in his hand, was feeling lonely for the first time in his life, and he didn't know what to do with it. She didn't turn around. She didn't say a word. She only stood in the doorway for 2 more seconds, and then she walked out of his study, and she didn't look back until she had closed the door to her own bedroom and leaned against it with her eyes shut. In the dark room behind her, he sat alone with the whiskey glass half empty and his shoulder still slowly bleeding, and for the first time in his life, he didn't reach for the telephone to call anyone at all. In the 4 days after that 3 o'clock morning, August stayed in the guest bedroom on the western side and didn't come down to the dining room, and Everly didn't see him, except for the sound of doors closing at irregular hours when the family's private doctors came to examine the wound in his shoulder. She returned to her schedule. She ran. She read. She ate alone. And on Saturday afternoon, when she had finished Bulgakov the week before and was searching for something heavier to keep her mind occupied enough not to return to the moment he had spoken her name in the doorway of the study, she went into the library and began searching through the high shelves she hadn't yet reached. The 9th shelf on the left, 3rd row down from the top, was where he kept books on naval history and old family albums with no labels on the spine. She pulled out a dark brown one, leather worn soft at the 4 corners, with no title on the spine, and carried it to the armchair by the window. She set the album on her lap and opened it slowly, because she had learned from her adoptive mother that old albums in powerful houses often contained more than their covers promised. The first 2 pages were black and white photographs. The wedding of Ezekiel and Adelaide Draven in a church outside Milan in the spring of 1980. Then came the ordinary family pictures. Ezekiel holding a dark-haired little boy, Adelaide in a fur coat on the steps of the Oyster Bay estate, Christmas dinners, summer days by the shore. She turned the pages steadily, not looking for anything specific, until she reached page 22. There she stopped. Page 22 held 4 color photographs mounted in paper corners. In the first 3, a young woman with straight black hair falling to her shoulders, and the exact same blue-gray eyes as August stood on a dock in the Hamptons, laughed in a restaurant whose location wasn't clear, sat on the grass in a park with an apple in her hand. It was Vesper Draven. Everly had seen photographs of Vesper before in old articles she had secretly searched up during her first week in the penthouse, and that face couldn't be mistaken. But in the 4th photograph, at the lower right of the page, Vesper wasn't standing alone. Beside her, one arm around Vesper's shoulder, head leaned into Vesper's head, smiling the smile Everly had seen every day for 11 years and hadn't seen once in the 8 years since, was Isabel Ashcroft. Isabel's copper-red hair, Isabel's green eyes, the cream cashmere sweater Isabel had worn on her 22nd birthday, her last birthday, 4 months before she died. Everly held the album with both hands and didn't realize she had stopped breathing until her lungs began to ache. In the lower right corner of the photograph, someone had written a small line in blue ink. July. Isabel and Vesper in Montauk. She set the album down on the table with extreme care, as if it were something that could explode if dropped, and went straight to her bedroom and locked the door. She took Isabel's letter from the innermost compartment of the handbag she had brought here from the first day. She opened it to the place she had opened 10,000 times before. There is a box. In their house. I sent it through V. Before. V. Everly had spent 8 years searching for a name, beginning with that letter among the people Isabel had known, and found no one. Because V wasn't an acquaintance's name. V wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a journalist, wasn't a friend from Columbia. V was a girl of 23, with her brother's blue-gray eyes, and V had died 4 months after that photograph was taken, 3 weeks before Isabel died, in a car that went off a bridge in Greenwich, Connecticut. Vesper Draven. She sat down on the edge of the bed, the letter in one hand and the photograph she had nearly forgotten she had slipped from the album and brought into the room in the other, and for the first time in 8 years she felt something that wasn't grief, wasn't loss, wasn't resignation. She felt something older than all three, something she hadn't been allowed to feel since she was 18. She felt anger, and she felt, for the first time since the wedding night, that she wasn't alone in this world anymore. Her sister hadn't died by her own hand. Her husband's sister hadn't died in a car accident. The two girls had known each other, had trusted each other, had discovered something dangerous enough for someone to kill them both within less than a month of each other. And Everly Hawthorne, the only person left in this world who knew that neither death had been an accident, would be the one to find out what had caused both of her sisters to die. She folded the letter again. She laid the photograph on top of it. She put both into the innermost compartment of her handbag. Then she went back out to the library, returned the album to its exact place on the 9th shelf to the left, 3rd row down, and left not a single sign that it had ever been touched. 10 days after the discovery in the library, August flew to Boston for the 2nd time that month, this time without warning and without leaving a message, only a short line in Margot's household book saying that he would be gone for 3 nights. Everly had been waiting for an opportunity like this ever since the afternoon she returned the album to the shelf. She had spent those 10 days observing, not the bodyguards, not the servants, but the men who came and went through August's study at different hours of the day, and she had identified exactly the one she needed. Orson Vale was a man of 45, lean, with hair gone silver too early at the temples, who came to the penthouse every Tuesday and Friday to sit with August for 2 hours after dinner, and whom Margot had once casually mentioned as the Draven family's consigliere since Ezekiel's time. She waited until Friday evening, when she knew Orson would come even with August away, because she had heard Margot say on the telephone that Mr. Vale wanted to stop by and look over the ledgers. Everly went down to the study at 7 o'clock. Orson was sitting alone at the desk, reading through a file, and he looked up when she entered without showing surprise, which she noted, because a man who wasn't surprised when his employer's wife walked into a room she had never before entered was a man who had expected this moment from some point long before it arrived. He stood. "Mrs. Draven," he said. "Mr. Vale," she said. "You may call me Orson. May I sit down?" She sat. He sat as well. For 5 seconds, neither of them spoke. And then Everly drew from the book she was carrying the photograph she had taken from the album 10 days earlier, and laid it face up on the desk between them. Orson looked at the photograph. He didn't pick it up. He didn't touch it. He only looked, and Everly watched his face long enough to see the thing she hadn't been certain of before but now knew with certainty. He had known. He had known this photograph existed. He had known about Vesper and Isabel. And in his tired gray eyes there was something almost like relief, as if he had been waiting 8 years for a young woman to sit before him with this exact photograph in her hand. "Mrs. Draven," he said, his voice rough and slow. "There are questions that, once spoken aloud, can never be taken back. And there are rooms that, once entered, can never be left as the same person who stepped inside." "I understand that," she said. "I've been in such a room for 8 years. I just didn't know its name." Orson looked at her for a very long time. She didn't blink. He let out a long breath, set the file aside, and said, "I can't answer your question, but there is someone who can. And she has been waiting 8 years for a girl intelligent enough and durable enough to survive long enough to meet her." "Who?" Everly asked. "Your mother-in-law," Orson said. "She has had people watching you from the day you set foot in this house, not to control you, but to protect you while waiting to see whether you were strong enough to know the truth. Mrs. Draven wants to see you tomorrow night, not at Oyster Bay, not anywhere with a name in the family books. At one of the family's warehouses at the Red Hook docks. I will come for you at 8 o'clock. You may refuse now, and none of us will ever speak of it again. Or you may go, but if you go, you must understand that you won't return as the woman you are tonight." She lifted the photograph from the desk. She slipped it back between the pages of the book in her hand. She stood. 8 o'clock, she said. "I'll be waiting by the basement elevator." She left the room without looking back, and Orson Vale, when he heard the door close behind her, sat back down in his chair and closed his eyes for one long second, and he whispered something in Italian that, had anyone heard it, they would have understood as a prayer for the dead. 5 minutes before 8 on Saturday evening, Everly went down to the basement in the service elevator wearing a black wool coat and low shoes, with no makeup, no telephone, carrying only Isabel's letter and the photograph in the innermost compartment of her handbag. Orson Vale was waiting by the rear entrance of the building in an old black Buick sedan with no family insignia, no darkened windows, no sign of any kind that the car belonged to August's organization. They didn't speak during the entire 40-minute drive across the Brooklyn Bridge and then down Van Brunt Street toward the Red Hook docks. And Everly watched the city pass beyond the glass and counted the streetlights to keep her mind from imagining what was waiting for her at the end of the road. The warehouse stood at the southern edge of the harbor, a 3-story red brick building from the 1930s that had belonged to the Draven family since August's grandfather. Orson led her through an unmarked side door, down a corridor lit by weak yellow light, and into an inner room that someone had cleaned and prepared for tonight. On a long wooden table in the center of the room sat a single desk, lamp, and a box. Adelaide Draven was standing beside the table in a gray wool coat, wearing no jewelry except Ezekiel's 2 rings, and she turned when Everly entered, but she didn't smile. "Thank you, Orson," she said. Orson stepped back out of the room and closed the door behind him. Adelaide pointed to the chair opposite her across the table. Everly sat. The box lay between them. It was smaller than Everly had imagined. Dark cedar wood, only as long as her 2 hands placed side by side, sealed with a layer of red wax where the lid met the body. The wax dried and lightly cracked with age, but still unbroken. On the lid, a single V had been carved by hand, the lines clumsy in the way of someone carving without proper tools. "This box has been in Hollis Keene's safe for 8 years, Adelaide said. "Hollis has been my personal attorney since before I married Ezekiel. Vesper brought this box to him on a Thursday afternoon in October, 3 weeks before she died. She told Hollis that if anything happened to her, he was to keep the box safe until a young woman came to ask him about Isabel Ashcroft. She didn't say who the girl would be. She didn't say when. She only said there would be a girl, and Hollis was to wait for the last girl to ask that name, and she would be the one to receive the box. Hollis waited 8 years. He contacted me for the first time on the afternoon after your wedding, when he saw your name in the papers and realized you were the only girl who would have reason to ask. We agreed to wait a little longer, until we were certain you would come. Today Orson called me and said that you had come." Everly couldn't speak for a very long moment. "Have you broken the seal?" she asked. "No," Adelaide said. "The seal is for you, not for me." Everly reached for the box. Her fingers trembled slightly when they touched the wood, and she didn't try to hide that from Adelaide, because Adelaide was the only person in that room from whom she didn't need to hide. She used her thumbnail to break the wax. It cracked in a straight line, and she lifted the lid. Inside were 3 things. The first was a small stack of photographs, tied with a black ribbon, 5 or 6 of them, which she would look at later. The second was a black USB drive with no label, exactly the sort Finn might have used to send one to August, but not that one, because this one had a small scratch at the corner that she remembered Vesper had made through the habit of someone who was always dropping things. The third was a pale yellow sheet of paper folded into 4, the same kind of paper Isabel had used for her final letter, the kind of paper the 2 girls had shared between them. She unfolded it. Vesper's handwriting slanted in the same hurried way as August's sister. One word struck through in the middle of the paragraph, a blur of ink at the lower corner where she had surely cried while writing. The contents were an unfinished letter to Isabel. "Belle, I found it out. Your father killed little Everly's mother, and not because of business, because Margaret was." The sentence there had been crossed out twice with such force that the pen tip tore the paper. "Belle, if anything happens to me, this USB is enough to bury both our families. My father is involved too, not in the way I thought, but enough that I don't know whether I should give it to him. I don't know whether I should kill him or save him. I don't know if he knows Margaret was murdered, or if he agreed to let it happen. Belle, call me. I'm scared. The page ended there, in the middle of the word I, unfinished. Everly folded the paper again with very careful hands and set it down on the table, and she looked at Adelaide through the yellow light of the lamp and said, in a voice very soft and very steady, "Now you're going to tell me." Adelaide nodded and began. "Your mother was a beautiful woman in the way the most beautiful women in New York in the 1990s often were," Adelaide began. "Not the kind of beauty made for parties and magazine covers, but the kind that made people fall quiet when she entered a room. Her name was Margaret Hawthorne. She graduated from Smith College in 1988, worked as an editor for a small publishing house in Midtown, lived alone in a 2-room apartment in the West Village, and had no family left alive after her father died when she was 24. Ezekiel met her in the winter of 1998, at an auction of rare books on the Upper East Side that I didn't attend because I had influenza. My husband and I had understood each other for a very long time before that, Adelaide said, her voice unshaken, that ours was a marriage between two families, and not between two people, and we had both accepted what needed to be accepted. Margaret was the one thing Ezekiel didn't accept. He loved her for 6 years, secretly, carefully, in the way a man like Ezekiel loved anything at all, by building a wall around it so no one could take it away. And in 1999, Margaret gave birth to a little girl. That little girl was you. He didn't place his name on the birth certificate, because he knew you would be safer if no one knew you were the daughter of the only woman he ever loved, a girl he had sworn to protect with a father's devotion, despite the fact that you shared no biological ties with him or the Draven lineage. He supported Margaret financially through a trust account he set up through Hollis Keene. He visited you whenever he could, not often, but often enough to know you as you grew. I knew about Margaret in 1999, a few months after you were born, when he told me himself. I didn't object. I agreed that if anything happened to him, I would protect both of you and your mother. Everly sat very still. Outside, the sound of waves from the harbor struck steadily against the wooden pilings beneath the warehouse floor. Adelaide went on. But there was someone else who knew, she said. Desmond Ashcroft. Desmond had been doing business with my family for 20 years, and there are things families do together in order to keep those things from ever leaking out. Desmond discovered Margaret in 2004, through a source in banking that I won't waste your time describing. He realized that if the day ever came when Ezekiel divorced me in order to acknowledge your mother publicly, the balance of power between the Draven family and the Ashcroft family would tilt toward us, because Margaret was a woman Ezekiel would protect at any cost, and because you, a new child, would alter every succession arrangement among the 5 families. He decided Margaret couldn't be allowed to live. On an April afternoon in 2005, Desmond had someone interfere with your mother's brakes. That road along the Long Island coast that day wasn't an accident. You were in the back seat, not because your mother was driving somewhere unimportant, but because it was time for Ezekiel to pick you up for that weekend. And Desmond didn't know that. Didn't know he nearly had you killed with her. Ezekiel knew within 48 hours exactly who had done it. He didn't have enough proof to do anything publicly, and if he acted, Desmond would use you as a weapon in retaliation, so he did the only thing he could do to keep you alive. He went to Desmond, without threats, without accusations, and asked for a favor. He asked Desmond and Beatrice to adopt you, under the name Hawthorne, never to be changed, and to raise you as a daughter in their house. In return, Ezekiel would never investigate Margaret's death, would never make his relationship with her public, and would step away from an important port agreement the Ashcroft family had wanted for 5 years. Desmond agreed, not because he cared about you, because he understood that keeping you alive under his roof was the best insurance against Ezekiel ever changing his mind. You became a hostage for 19 years without ever knowing it. Everly didn't cry. She had gone past the ability to cry by the second minute of this story. And Vesper, she said. And Isabel. Adelaide closed her eyes for 1 second. Vesper learned the truth in 2016, 8 years ago, through a set of old papers belonging to her father that she went looking for when she began asking questions about her mother. She told Isabel, not because Isabel was Desmond's daughter, but because the two of them had become close in the summer at Montauk, when they were both 19, and had discovered that they both shared a protective bond over a younger sister, who was the secret link between their two families, the girl Isabel had spent her whole life protecting. The two of them investigated together for 4 months. They found enough. They were preparing to bring the evidence to Ezekiel and to me. Desmond found out before they could. Vesper died 3 weeks before Isabel. Both deaths were ordered by Desmond. 2 years later, when Ezekiel still wouldn't stop digging into Vesper's death, which he never believed had been an accident, Desmond had him killed too. The man who carried it out died in a fire 3 months later, very conveniently. And Finn, Everly said. Adelaide opened her eyes. Finn has known everything since the day his sister died. Finn was the one who helped his father clean Isabel's room to make it look like a suicide. Finn sent the USB to August 3 days before the wedding. Not so August would know the truth, but so August would believe you were a spy planted by a rival family and kill you in the fury of the wedding night. That was the final piece in a plan 19 years in the making. You were the last thread still tying your husband's father to your mother. And if you died by your husband's hand, both families would shatter in a war the Ashcroft family would win. Everly placed both hands on the table and kept them there. And my husband, she said. He knows nothing about me. Not yet, Adelaide said. But he will. Tonight. August returned to the penthouse at 11 o'clock on Sunday night, one night earlier than expected, and Margot had texted Everly when his car was still 10 minutes from the Brooklyn Bridge. Everly had been ready since 6 that evening. The cedar box inside a linen bag, Vesper's unfinished letter wrapped again in its own separate envelope, the USB drive that Orson had asked an outside specialist to decrypt over the past 20 hours, now able to be opened on any computer. She didn't wait in the drawing room. She waited in the place he would come once he realized she wasn't in her room. The place he always came when there was something he had no words to name. The place Margot had accidentally told her about 2 weeks earlier, when she asked why he sometimes vanished in the middle of the night, and no one knew where he went. The vintage car garage on the penthouse's private basement level, a space 40 meters long lit by bulbs hanging from cords along the concrete ceiling, where August kept 6 cars he had collected over 10 years. A midnight blue Jaguar E-Type, 2 antique Alfa Romeos from the 1960s, a black original Porsche 911, and 2 others Everly didn't know the names of. She sat on a folding metal chair in the middle of the garage, the linen bag resting across her knees, and she waited. He came down by the internal staircase at 11:28. He was wearing a black wool coat, the collar of his shirt unbuttoned at the throat, and he stopped on the last step when he saw her. 3 long seconds. He didn't ask what she was doing there. He already knew, because everything in the way she had arranged herself, back straight, both hands resting on the bag, eyes steady and unblinking, had already told him she hadn't come here to beg and hadn't come here to explain. She had come to give him something. "Sit down," she said. He sat in the metal chair across from her, 5 feet apart on the concrete floor, and she placed the bag between them. She took out the cedar box first. He recognized it at once. She saw that in a tiny movement, a tightening of his jaw he didn't hide quickly enough. The hand-carved V on the lid. She didn't need to explain. Then she took out Vesper's unfinished letter. She handed it to him. He read it. She had watched the faces of men being broken for 19 years in the Ashcroft house, and she knew the different shapes of collapse. The collapse that came with shouting, the collapse that came with tears, the collapse that came with a fist through a wall. August broke in a way she had never seen before. He didn't move a millimeter. His jaw didn't twitch. His eyes didn't fill. He only became very still. And inside that stillness, if she looked closely enough, she could see the entire architecture of a man who had spent 37 years building precision as his foundation beginning to crack along one line after another. Silently, from within, he read the letter again. Then a third time, he set it down on the box in his lap. He reached for the USB drive when she held it out, without needing her to say a word. He nodded once, meaning later. He would watch it later. For now, he didn't need to. He already knew enough without seeing it. He sat motionless for another long stretch of time. "Everly," he said at last. "Yes," she said. "I should have asked you," he said. "I know," she answered. "You are a precise man, but precision without questions is a form of arrogance. I heard those words somewhere in the past 4 months, and now I understand them." He let out a faint sound, a brief breath that wasn't joy and wasn't quite laughter. "My mother," he said. "Your mother?" she confirmed. He stood. He came 3 steps toward her, then lowered himself onto one knee on the cold concrete in front of her chair, not to beg, but to bring his eyes level with hers, because he had finally understood that this wasn't a moment to stand above anyone. He took her right hand in both of his, not squeezing, only holding it, like a man holding something he knew he had almost broken. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Not what is proper, not what is correct, what you need." She looked down at his hands wrapped around hers. The cut across the back of his left hand had healed into a pale line. She thought for 10 seconds. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to speak it the right way. For the first time. "Time," she said. "And the truth. From both sides. Not when it is convenient, but when it is asked for." He nodded. "And," she said, "justice. Not forgiveness. Not revenge. Justice for Vesper. For Isabel. And for my mother." He held her hand for one more long beat. Then he said, in a voice that didn't shake and didn't bargain, You will have all three. I swear it on the name of my father, who chose the wrong way to protect you, and on the name of my sister, who died because she loved your sister." Everly let her hand remain in his for 1 second more. Then she drew it back, not hurriedly, not coldly, only enough to rise to her feet. "We begin tonight," she said. "Tonight," he agreed, and they left the garage together, not holding hands, not touching, but walking beside one another all the way to the stairs, and it was the closest they had come to truly walking side by side in 4 months without a wall between them. What happened in the 3 weeks after the night in the garage happened the way families in New York had handled their business for 100 years, in rooms without windows, on papers that were never signed, through telephone calls that would leave no record behind afterward. August didn't tell Everly the details. He kept his word about the truth from both sides, but he also understood that some truths, once spoken aloud, would force her to become a witness to things she shouldn't have to witness. She knew what she needed to know, and not a line more. Finn came first. On a Tuesday evening, August summoned representatives of the 5 great families to a private restaurant in Bay Ridge, to the back room. No menu, no waitstaff, only 6 men and a projector. He showed them what was on Vesper's USB drive. He showed them the file Orson had compiled over 10 days, photographs of meetings between Finn and the men who had been hired to clean up Isabel's room 8 years earlier, telephone recordings he had obtained through a source inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation that he had kept in reserve for an occasion like this. The 5 families voted in secret. The result was 4 out of 5, with 1 abstention no one would ever mention. Finn wasn't killed. That was a calculated decision, because Ashcroft blood spilled by Draven hands would have meant a war no one wanted, and because death was an escape, a man who had done what Finn had done didn't deserve to receive. Instead, he was escorted out of his apartment at 3 in the morning by 2 men he had never met, and he was taken to an old 20-acre farm in upstate New York, near a town called Chateauguay that few people in the city had ever heard of. There he would live the rest of his life. He had a 1-story cabin, a kitchen large enough to cook 9 meals, a shelf of books containing only the kind that would never make him dangerous, and a supervisor rotating in shifts 200 meters away, 24 hours a day, for every remaining year of his life. He had no telephone. He had no internet. He had no visitors. If he tried to leave, the agreement of the 5 families had already specified exactly what would happen, and he knew it. Desmond came 4 days after Finn. There was no meeting, no vote. Desmond was the head of a family, and the head of a family was handled differently. On a Saturday afternoon, Desmond Ashcroft was found in his study in the Upper East Side house, seated at his desk, with a whiskey glass half empty in his hand, and the expression of a man who hadn't had time to understand what had just happened to him. The New York Police Department arrived within 40 minutes. The medical examiner arrived within 80. The official conclusion, signed and sealed within 48 hours, was stroke caused by a clot in a cerebral artery, an unforeseeable complication in a 59-year-old man with a history of high blood pressure he had failed to treat adequately. There was no investigation, no full autopsy. Not a single newspaper asked a question. That was the way New York worked when it wanted something to disappear, and it had wanted this to disappear. Beatrice came to the penthouse 7 days after Desmond's funeral. She came without warning on a Wednesday evening. Margot led her upstairs without asking Everly because Margot had understood from the look in her eyes that this was a moment that couldn't wait. Beatrice was wearing a black wool coat, 2 sizes too large, her hair unbrushed, and when Everly entered the drawing room, she had dropped to her knees on the carpet and begun to weep the way only a person weeps who has held that crying back for 8 years and no longer has the strength to hold it any longer. "I knew," Mother said. "I knew from the morning Belle died. I found a piece of paper in Desmond's desk drawer that night, and I knew, and I said nothing. I didn't tell the police. I didn't tell you. I watched you cry over your sister's coffin, and I said nothing. I let you lose your sister. I let you live in that house with that man. I drank so I wouldn't have to remember. I drank so I wouldn't have to look at your face every morning. I'm sorry. I know sorry means nothing, but I have nothing else." Everly stood looking at her. She didn't sit down. She didn't hold out a hand. For 8 years she had thought that if this moment ever came, she would scream. But standing there, she couldn't find a scream anywhere inside herself. She couldn't find forgiveness anywhere inside herself. She could only find exhaustion, and something very small beneath the exhaustion that she didn't want to name. "Can you stand up?" she said. Beatrice rose unsteadily. Everly called Vincenzo from the hallway, and 20 minutes later, a car was waiting in the basement. She walked Beatrice to the car without touching her. That night, she took her to a rehabilitation center in a small town called Litchfield, Connecticut, a quiet facility Hollis Keene had arranged over the telephone in 30 minutes. And when they arrived, Everly signed the sponsorship papers as next of kin. She didn't stay for breakfast. She didn't embrace her. She didn't promise to visit. But when the car had left the gates of the center, and she was sitting in the back seat watching the autumn woods pass beyond the window, she realized, with a surprise that startled her, that she was crying, quietly. Not for Beatrice, not for Desmond, not for Finn, but for her sister. At last, for the first time, after 8 years, 5 years passed in the way time passes for people who have decided to rebuild everything from the ground up, slowly, deliberately, without the kind of blinding milestones outsiders can point to, only a great many mornings following one after another, a great many dinners no one walked away from halfway through, a great many moments when a question was asked before a conclusion was drawn, until one day they both realized they had become a family, and neither of them could remember exactly when that had happened. In October of the 5th year, on a Saturday afternoon in Brooklyn, Everly closed the office of the Isabel and Vesper Foundation at 4 o'clock, 2 hours earlier than usual, and walked home through the yellow-leafed streets of Park Slope. The foundation had begun with 3 employees in a rented room on the 2nd floor of an old bookshop, and now it had 22 employees across 2 floors on 4th Avenue, receiving an average of 40 women each month, each one of them someone who had been forced to leave a home that should have been safe and had become the opposite. Everly didn't stand on stages, didn't speak at fundraisers, didn't give interviews. She met every woman who came to the foundation in her first week there, made each of them a cup of tea, and sat with them long enough for them to understand that there was someone on the far side of their fear who had walked that road and lived. That was the work she did. That was the work she had chosen, and kept, and would keep. At home, in the 4-story townhouse in Brooklyn Heights, that they had moved to from the penthouse 2 years after the wedding because Everly had said, and August had agreed, that a child shouldn't grow up on the 68th floor, 3-year-old Oliver August Draven was trying to teach his 1-year-old sister, Isabel Vesper Draven, how to stack wooden blocks into a tower without knocking it down at the 4th block. Isabel had her father's blue-gray eyes and her mother's slight build, and something in the way she looked around a room, quiet, attentive, observing before reacting, that made August look away every time he saw it, because the child reminded him of 2 women who weren't here to see her. In the past 5 years, August had learned the things he had never known he needed to learn. He had learned how to ask before concluding. He had learned that precision without humility is only another form of fear disguised as power. He had learned how to say, "I don't know," 3 words he hadn't allowed himself to speak in the first 15 years of leading a family. The other families in New York said he had gone soft. The people who truly knew him understood that he had simply stopped being afraid of being seen uncertain. On their 5th anniversary, they didn't hold a party. They didn't invite guests. There was only a family dinner in the small dining room on the 2nd floor of the townhouse. Adelaide had come in from Oyster Bay and was sitting at the head of the table with Oliver on her lap, and little Isabel was tapping the table with a wooden spoon in a rhythm she seemed to be the only one who understood. August rose with a glass of wine. He wasn't a man who often made toasts. In 5 years, he had raised a glass exactly twice in front of Everly, and this was the 3rd time. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," he said, in the steady voice Everly now understood, was the voice he used when he meant what he said, not when he was merely reciting. She looked at him across the candlelight, the man who had once left her standing alone in a wedding dress, and had spent the 5 years after that learning the answer to the question he had judged too quickly, and she didn't blink, because she had chosen not to blink from the very first night. "You're paying it," she said, "every day." He raised his glass. She raised hers. 3-year-old Oliver, watching his parents, copied them with his own glass of milk, spilling half of it down Adelaide's dress, and little Isabel clapped her hands and laughed with a sound so bright that for 1 second the whole room fell silent just to hear her, and then the entire family laughed. Adelaide included, August included. Outside the dining room windows, a Brooklyn autumn evening stretched across the red brick rooftops, patient, indifferent, in the way time always is. But inside, in the warm light of a room that had once been a dream none of them had dared hope for, something entirely different was true. There is a lesson Everly and August's story leaves for anyone who has listened this far, and it is that certainty left unquestioned is a form of blindness, and that people who truly love each other aren't the ones who never make mistakes with each other, but the ones willing to stand still in the moment their mistake is exposed and choose to stay and repair it every day, through many days, through many years. That justice doesn't always arrive with noise, that forgiveness isn't a gift we owe to those who have wounded us, that sometimes the kindest thing we can do for a mother who failed us is take her to the place where she can be helped and then keep walking, and that the quietest women in a room are often the ones who have survived the most and will be the last ones still standing after everyone else has fallen. If this story touched you in any way, please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the stories that come next. Press like to support us in continuing to tell stories like this one, and share this video with someone you think needs to hear it tonight. How do you feel about Everly's story? And have you ever had to stand in a room where someone you trusted looked at you and came to the wrong conclusion about who you were? What did you choose to do in that moment? Leave a comment below so we can listen from the deepest part of your heart, because every story you share becomes part of the next story we tell. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days beside the people you love. Goodbye. And we'll see you again in the next video.